The New York Times has profiled an absolutely wild story of a Nepali national who was recruited into the Russian military. We've reported on Russia's recruitment of foreign fighters for a long time, but this is probably the most in-depth look we've gotten into their operation. And we're going to be breaking down just how the math works and why this is such a lucrative scheme for Putin. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay. So this is a really interesting New York Times article that I'm not going to go over entirely. Obviously, the reporters did a really good job running down this story, but it profiles a young Nepali man, Krishna Bahadur Sahai, who was recruited under the promise that he was going to be working as a security guard in a like depot type position in the Russian military, but when he arrived, he was instead put through a 2-week military training and then shipped off to the front lines. Now, there's a bunch of details here that I don't think have ever been publicly discussed, at least in Western media. Right? It profiles, again, this guy who is a 24-year-old civil engineer, so actually a college-educated Nepali man who finished university and was unable to get any more work after a short-term contract building water tanks ended last year, right? And so he was put in touch with human traffickers, which, of course, this is a fascinating sort of niche, right? Where we know that a lot of times human traffickers exploit individuals in impoverished countries who want to get into lucrative work in wealthier countries. And basically, as we discuss a lot in this channel, where there is a buyer and a seller, someone will emerge and to make that market happen. So Krishna paid the traffickers $5,600, and because his contract in Russia would make him $2,200 a month. He believed he would be working as a guard at a base, not serving on the front line, and that he would receive Russian citizenship as a reward for his service. And as they point out, these human traffickers are pretty much staples of Nepal, again, one of the poorest countries in the world, that oftentimes recruit Nepalese to work as maids, prostitutes, guards, nannies, cooks, and soldiers. When I was in Afghanistan, it was extremely common to see Nepalese acting actually as cooks and guards. Unlike Russia, U.S. contracted Nepalis actually fulfilled those non-combat roles. Again, unlike the Russian military, the United States, if we fight our own wars, we're not cowards. But the Nepalis would often fulfill support roles for, again, cooking, cleaning, usually doing guard work because it was seen as safer. Because Nepalese nationals didn't have any connections to Afghanistan, there was less risk that they would become infiltrated by the Taliban, right? The Taliban didn't have Nepalese, they didn't speak Nepalese, so it was seen as much safer to bring in a Nepalese security guard. I would trust a Nepalese security guard 1,000 times more than I would trust an Afghan security guard, not because of any sort of like Afghan bad, but simply because the Taliban were made up of Afghans. I don't know what else to tell you. So this sort of contract middleman type of work was very typical. I'm not sure if in the United States these traffickers received these huge commissions. I think they likely did things the American way, which is the United States wants to keep its hands clean of any kind of gray area dealings, and so they hire a contractor. So the contractor makes money from the organization, from the military, in our case, and in exchange provides manpower with sufficient documentation that the U.S. doesn't really ask a lot of questions, right? So what happens, though, when this man signs up with human traffickers to go serve in the Russian military, right? So these traffickers, of course, just lie through their teeth about what these Nepalese are going to be doing, and they are, again, institutions in Nepal. The smugglers, they point out, even have people in the immigration authorities. So Mr. Shahi arrives at the Russian base in late October, right? He, of course, said that his impression, the base was several hundred Nepalese and a few Chinese recruits. Really interesting. This is something we haven't seen. I've never heard an account of foreign fighters being trained before. And he says that basically it's all Nepalese. Now, on one hand, it may make sense to group ethnic groups together. For example, we know that there is a fair number of African recruits as well. And it's likely that they are all trained together. But still, the fact is that they are talking about hundreds of Nepalese at a time tells us that, again, if you're running several hundred Nepalese training classes with a few Chinese recruits, and the training is only 2 weeks. No, he'd been promised 3 months of training. And then he was sent to Donetsk. That tells us, again, that the number we're looking at annually, we're going to be doing a lot of this using this calculator here. In case you're wondering, if you've ever worked as an analyst, you know that the old desktop calculator is your bestie friend. Let's say several hundred. Let's be generous. Let's say he meant, let's say on the low end, he was talking about 300, and they're running them every 2 weeks, which means you can run, let's say, 20 classes a year. So you're talking about 6,000 Nepalese passing through this Russian military training pipeline. And again, that's assuming 3 weeks of the year it isn't running, or there's a period, a couple of days between classes, and that there are only that there weren't multiple classes running together. And so he already, the story goes exactly the way we'd expect it to. Minimal training, taken to the front line. He says even inmates are taken to the front line. His frontline unit was a mix of Russian convicts and Nepalis. The inmates were heavy drinkers and basically assholes. Again, imagine being a college-educated civil engineer in Nepal, and then you're serving with complete sociopathic assholes in the form of Russian military prisoners. And military prisoners so disliked that they look at serving in a meat wave, an assault unit, as preferable to staying in prison, right? And so the first time he tries to escape, of course, an artillery barrage takes out three of his compatriots. Him and other deserters tried to flee. Here's what's interesting. The traffickers show up again. They say, you paid us a lot of money to get you here. You can pay us money and we'll get you out again, because traffickers are assholes. And that's what they do. But of course, the traffickers take his money and stick it to him. They don't actually have a plan to leave. They get him into Mariupol, which doesn't really help anybody. A quick look at a map would tell you Mariupol is not going to get you out anywhere. It's going to get you could sail out to the Black Sea, but that's a good way to get killed. So instead, they were turned back over to the Russian military. And then he is sent into a bunker where he stays. And then a few days later, Russian commander said, you're going to be storming this Ukrainian trench line. Ukrainians, of course, saw them coming and shot Mr. Shahi 6 times. Dude's 50 Cent out here. And you could see how frequently he was shot. It looks like he may have been shot, or some of those look like shrapnel type injuries. But he crawled to a first aid station. He said the Russians actually provided decent medical care, flown by emergency helicopter to Rostov-on-Don. Surgeons removed the bullets, patched up his wounds, and then he was stuck in a hospital. There, he begged a Russian guard for a cell phone, and then managed to use the cell phone to actually not pay traffickers, but get out. And in a classic, this is just like classic trafficker story. To escape from Russia, he just drives to the Nepali embassy. He literally finds a taxi driver. He says, take me to the Russian embassy. I will pay you when I get there. And the taxi driver drives him 15 straight hours to the Nepali embassy, drops him off, doesn't take a dime from the guy. And the Nepali embassy is like, you were trafficked? What the hell, dude? Like, come in. We'll get you out of here. Now, of course, it's a little more complicated than that. But the reality is that this is a classic story, and we expand out the story. We hear more and more about the fact that there are thousands of Nepalese who claim their family members have simply disappeared into Russia. And it's really, really frightening for a lot of these Nepalis. But let's talk a little bit about the larger story here, right? Let's zoom out a little bit. You should definitely check out this story, right? You could just Google it, man. I'm not going to hold your hand here. But if you're interested in seeing what that combat might have been like for him, we actually have twice a week, I do deep dive analysis of the drone footage, the GoPro videos, the combat footage from the front lines. We have a good look at what it's like to be one of those combatants on either side of the equation. But that analysis is just for members, and it's on combatvetnews.com. YouTube won't let me show you combat footage anymore, so I put it all on here. It's also the way to support me and keep me independent and able to do this every single day. So any one of these tiers will get you access to those twice weekly members only videos. But if you want to do the Q&A, which is awesome, a chance to ask me anything, Lieutenant tier and above get access to those videos. And of course, they get the shout outs at the end of videos. So check it out. combatvetnews.com. Link is in the description. All right. Why? That's the question we're left with. Why would anyone do this? It's public that the conflict has an incredibly high casualty rate for Russians. And one, it's not clear that this information percolates into particularly rural Nepal. And it seems like this is a tremendous recruitment pipeline for the Russians. This is as of February. So 6 months ago, they're reporting 15,000 Nepalese, which our math says checks out, right? If you're talking about 6,000 a year, February marks just about 2 years of the war. So that's what we're probably thinking. That estimate seems actually spot on, right? And so why then? Well, the answer is simple: money. We talked about how Mr. Shahi was going to make about $2,200 a month. For context, the annual salary in Nepal is about 7,000 USD, right? And the average hourly wage, wage, $3.55. So again, handy dandy calculator. Let's get the calculator out here, and we'll show you just why this math works out so well, right? So you could see $2,200 a month, right, is what the Russians are making. And then you have 773, right, divide by 12. So the average Nepali is making about $600 a month. So that's about 4 times the average. Remember, guys, the average, especially in a poor country, is not really reflective of most people's reality. Just like this, right? In your city, there's probably a couple of people who are turbo, super, mega rich, and they are bumping up the average salary of everybody else, right? It's like the old meme when Bill Gates walks into a party. Everyone, the average person at that party now makes $1 billion a year. All right. So the actual median salary is going to be even lower. To get some equivalence here, that is the equivalent in the United States of making about $220,000 or $240,000. Right? Average U.S. worker makes about $60,000 a year. So ask yourself, would you sign up to fight for the Russian military for $240,000 a year? Maybe not. Hopefully not you guys. Hopefully you would know better. But you see the appeal. You see the appeal very quickly. But the other person who benefits is Russia, right? Because we can get out the calculator again and we can learn something about Russia. We know, for example, that Russia's burn rate, Russia needs about 25,000 men. Let's see if we can do this. 25,000 men a month to sustain its current combat operational losses, which means they need to bring in about 300,000 new bodies. So, in a given year. But how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? And if you're talking about 6,000, right? So you have about 6,000 new soldiers going through just that one training pipeline, by the way, in a year, right? And then by that, you realize that, yeah, you're like, oh, it's only 2% of Russia's of Russia's final target. But let's say, again, let's say you get the Nepalese, and let's say you recruit an equal number from the African countries, right? Now, things are looking better, right? You're talking 4%. Sounds crazy. It sounds dumb, right? But remember, guys, that's 1/25th. That's the equivalent of half a month's worth of soldiers that Russia is recruiting and putting out to fight, right? So that's the Nepalese are such desirable soldiers for Russia because when they get killed, their families don't live in Russia. There are no political consequences when Putin gets a Nepalese person killed. Nepal, all right, and the West already sanctioned Russia. They're not going to sanction them more. And so for Putin, he sits there and he goes, listen, this is the equivalent of not having to run this intensive recruitment program in Russia for 2 weeks out of the year. And instead, we get to offset that with these Nepalese fighters and Congolese and Chinese and Cuban, right? We've seen a lot of these fighters. So understand that, again, think about it as being one bite at a time. And again, 4% sounds like a lot, but that's 1 in 25 soldiers serving in this fight that are brought in are going to be Nepalese. That's a lot. That's a lot. Nepalese, right, or Congolese, Nepalese or African, or Cuban. But I think those are the largest ones that we've seen. We've also heard of some Bangladeshi. We've heard of even Indian nationals. There's a fair number from all over. But I hope you guys got some value out of this. I hope you guys gained some perspective of just some of the stuff Russia is out here trying to do. And just kind of the reality of this war, man. Like, there's so much mis and disinformation. It's ramping up again. I think with the U.S. election coming up, Putin really wants to try to demoralize, confuse, obfuscate what's really going on out there. And I'm trying to push back on it as best I can. Anyway, guys, I appreciate you so much. Huge thank you to Colonel tier members at combatvetnews.com, especially James Sterling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Knudsen, Bastian Hemmerling, Yanko Georgiev, as well as all the lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys. Thank you so much. And I will see you all in the next one. Cheers.